The Quakequake Crisis of 5341. CE, cataclysmic event that shook the future. On the tranquil shores of the Bering Sea, the Aleutian Islands' tranquility was shattered by an unprecedented series of earthquakes. As the sun rose over the waters, a sense of unease settled over the islanders, signaling the start of a catastrophic event. The first quake struck without warning, its epicenter deep beneath the ocean floor. The tremors rippled through the islands like gentle waves, causing minimal damage to the ancient settlements. However, this was merely the precursor to a more devastating sequence of events. As the minutes ticked by, the earthquakes grew in intensity and frequency. The ground cracked and split, releasing massive amounts of stored energy that had been building up for millennia. Panic set in as the islanders scrambled to find shelter from the relentless onslaught. The quakes were not the only source of destruction. The Aleutian Islands' unique geography, with its chain of volcanic mountains stretching across the archipelago, became a deadly force multiplier. The volcanoes, already sensitive to seismic activity, began to rumble and roar as magma rose to the surface. Eruptions of unprecedented ferocity spewed ash and molten rock into the air, blanketing the islands in a thick layer of toxic dust. As chaos reached its peak, massive tsunamis crashed against the shores, sweeping away entire villages and sending panicked survivors fleeing for higher ground. The once pristine beaches were now scarred by the relentless pounding of the waves, as if the very earth itself was trying to expel its pent-up fury. The skies grew dark, a thick haze of ash and smoke obscuring the sun. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of burning rock and the cries of the desperate. Amidst this maelstrom, the Aleutian Islanders' ancient way of life teetered on the brink of collapse. As the quakes finally began to subside, the extent of the devastation became clear. Entire towns lay in ruins, their homes reduced to rubble. The once thriving fishing fleets were now beached and broken, their nets tangled and useless. The very fabric of the island society was torn asunder, leaving only despair and hopelessness in its wake. In the aftermath, the Aleutian Islanders struggled to rebuild and recover from this catastrophic event. They worked tirelessly to restore their communities, but the scars of the Quakequake crisis would linger for generations to come. The legacy of that fateful day would serve as a reminder of nature's awe-inspiring power and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Quakequake Crisis of 41 CE, a cataclysmic event that shaped the future. As the sun dipped into the Pacific Ocean, the Aleutian Islands teetered on the brink of chaos. The inhabitants had grown accustomed to gentle tremors that rocked their homes, but nothing could have prepared them for the seismic upheaval that was about to unfold. It was a day that would etch itself into the annals of history as one of unmitigated disaster, forever altering the course of their lives. Without warning, a faint rumble transformed into a deafening roar, sending shockwaves through the island's fragile ecosystem like ripples on a pond. The landmasses convulsed as if alive and writhing in agony. Villages built upon shifting sands and precarious perches crumbled, their wooden frames shattered like matchsticks. The cacophony of collapsing buildings, screams of terror, and the constant rumble of the quake created an apocalyptic symphony that echoed across the islands. As the timbers subsided, survivors stumbled out into the eerie silence, surveying the devastation with numb, disbelieving eyes. Forests once verdant and lush now lay ravaged and blackened, their ancient trees splintered like toothpicks. The skies, once a brilliant blue, turned a sickly shade of gray, choked by the acrid haze of dust and debris. As the full extent of the disaster became apparent, the people of the Aleutian Islands struggled to come to terms with their new reality. Their homes, livelihoods, and way of life had been irreparably altered. The island's delicate ecosystem teetered on the brink of collapse, its intricate web of dependencies shattered by the quake's sheer force. News of the disaster spread, prompting neighboring communities to send aid and assistance to the affected regions. Rescue teams combed through the rubble, searching for survivors and providing medical care to those who had suffered injuries. The international community rallied behind them, offering support and resources in the face of this unprecedented catastrophe. In the aftermath of the Quakequake crisis, the Aleutian Islands would never be the same. Their people, though resilient and resourceful, would have to adapt to a new reality marked by uncertainty and fragility. This event would serve as a stark reminder of humanity's powerlessness against the forces of nature and its indomitable will in the face of adversity. The Quakequake Crisis of 41 CE would go down in history as a testament to the enduring spirit of those who call this remote archipelago home, serving as a beacon of hope and resilience for generations to come. The Aleutian Islands, a remote archipelago in the Pacific Northwest, had long been considered a peaceful and isolated region, untouched by the tumultuous forces that shaped human history elsewhere. For centuries, the island's rugged landscape and harsh climate kept them hidden from prying eyes, allowing their indigenous inhabitants to live in harmony with nature. The Aleut people, skilled hunters and gatherers, had developed a unique culture adapted to the unforgiving environment, where survival depended on the delicate balance between sea, land, and sky. But on February 12, 5341 BCE, everything changed. A sudden, profound seismic event shook the very foundations of the islands, unleashing a catastrophe that would come to be known as the Quakequake Crisis. The earth trembled with unprecedented ferocity, releasing pent-up energy stored in the tectonic plates beneath the ocean floor. The island's crust cracked and groaned, spewing forth massive waves that crashed against the shorelines like titans awakening from a slumber. As the quake's fury subsided, the Aleut people emerged to survey the devastation. Their once pristine villages lay in ruins, with homes and temples reduced to rubble. The fishery was decimated as schools of fish were swept away by the turbulent waters. The landscape itself had been reshaped as new fault lines sprouted like open wounds, releasing noxious gases that choked the air. The aftermath of the Quakequake crisis was nothing short of apocalyptic. The once clear skies turned a sickly shade of yellow as ash and smoke billowed from the ravaged terrain. The sea itself seemed to writhe in agony, its normally crystal waters now churning with dark, turbulent energy. As the days passed, an eerie silence settled over the islands, punctuated only by the occasional rumble of aftershocks. In the face of this unrelenting calamity, the Aleut people struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their misfortune. Their ancient ways of life were disrupted beyond recognition, as the very fabric of their world had been rent asunder. The Quakequake Crisis would forever alter the course of history in these once peaceful islands, leaving an indelible mark on the psyche of those who lived through its horrors. Here's an improved version of the narrative. The Aleutian Islands' unique geology, shaped by millions of years of volcanic activity, has long fascinated geologists and locals alike. The rugged terrain was sculpted by countless eruptions, caldera formations, and tectonic plate movements, creating a breathtakingly beautiful yet eerily unstable landscape. As the Pacific Plate slowly slides beneath the North American plate, the Aleutian Islands find themselves at the intersection of these two massive geological forces. This process, known as subduction, has been ongoing for millions of years, generating immense pressure and heat that eventually gives rise to volcanic activity. The region's geology is a complex tapestry of fault lines, fissures, and fractures. The Pacific Plate's leading edge, Aleutian Arc, forms a 1,200-mile-long chain of volcanoes. The islands themselves are a jigsaw puzzle of crustal fragments pieced together over time by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tectonic forces. For centuries prior to the Quakequake Crisis, the Aleutian Islands experienced numerous significant earthquakes, each one testament to the region's seismic vitality. However, these events were seen as natural occurrences in this geologically active zone, with local residents developing a keen sense of awareness about subtle signs preceding such occurrences. Despite their familiarity with the Earth's rhythms, the people of the Aleutian Islands were ill-prepared for what was to come. The sheer magnitude and frequency of quakes during this period took everyone by surprise, striking without warning and leaving even the most seasoned residents stunned and helpless in the face of nature's fury. As the days passed, earthquakes intensified and grew more frequent, as if the very fabric of the Earth were unraveling. The once stable terrain began to writhe and twist like a living thing in agony. Cracks opened in the ground, spewing forth steam and gas from hidden fissures. Volcanoes erupted, sending columns of ash and rock into the air, as if trying to exorcise some ancient evil. The people of the Aleutian Islands were caught off guard by this unprecedented onslaught. Their lives turned upside down as the earth beneath them trembled and convulsed. In the face of such catastrophic events, even the most resilient individuals felt powerless against the might of nature's fury. The Quakequake Crisis of 5341 CE, a catastrophic event that shook the future, February 12, 341 CE, marked a fateful day in the history of the Aleutian Islands. The once quiescent archipelago was transformed into the epicenter of a cataclysmic event that would forever alter its fate. As the earth trembled beneath their feet, the people of the islands were plunged into chaos. The warning signs emerged quietly, with faint tremors reverberating through the rugged terrain in the early hours of the day. Eventually, the inhabitants thought it was just another minor earthquake, a familiar occurrence in this seismically active region. However, as the vibrations intensified and the ground began to heave, they realized that something was terribly amiss. As the sun rose over the horizon, the earth gave way to an unprecedented deluge of seismic activity. Earthquakes of unfathomable magnitude struck repeatedly, each one more violent than the last. The island's rugged mountainside crumbled, sending massive boulders tumbling down slopes and crashing into the ocean below. The cacophony of sounds was deafening, a symphony of destruction that echoed across the archipelago. Panic set in as families were torn apart and communities were fragmented by the sheer force of the quakes. Buildings collapsed, structures toppled, and the earth beneath their feet gave way. The once thriving villages now lay in ruins, their inhabitants struggling to survive amidst the rubble. As the crisis unfolded, a phenomenon unlike anything witnessed before became apparent. Massive tsunamis began to form in the Pacific Ocean, triggered by the sheer power of the earthquakes. These towering walls of water crashed against the island's shores with devastating force, inundating coastal communities and destroying entire ecosystems. In the aftermath of this cataclysmic event, the people of the Aleutian Islands were left to pick up the pieces and rebuild their shattered lives. The Quakequake Crisis had reshaped not only the landscape but also the very fabric of their society. As they struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of the disaster, they knew that their world would never be the same again. This event marked a turning point in the history of the Aleutian Islands, one that would forever shape the destiny of its people and the region as a whole. The Quakequake Crisis of 5341 CE was a catastrophe of unparalleled proportions, leaving an indelible mark on the annals of time. The Aleutian Islands, once a tranquil archipelago, was suddenly thrust into chaos as the earth convulsed in violent spasms, shattering the very foundations of the land. Panic spread like wildfire as residents scrambled to flee coastal areas, their lives turned upside down by the sheer force of the quakes. As the initial tremors subsided, a cacophony of cries for help erupted from those caught in the midst of the disaster. The once familiar terrain was now a treacherous expanse of twisted rock and debris-strewn streets, where buildings crumbled like sand castles before the unforgiving sea. Emergency services were quickly overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster as ambulances and fire trucks struggled to navigate rubble-filled roads. Paramedics and firefighters battled against impossible odds to reach those trapped beneath the wreckage, their shouts of hurry lost in the din of destruction. Communication networks were severely disrupted, with phone lines snapping like twigs under the force of the tremors. Radio broadcasts went silent, leaving the desperate populace with nothing but their own ragged breathing and the creaking groans of the stricken landscape. As night fell on the islands, the darkness was illuminated only by the flickering lights of makeshift campfires and lanterns. The quakes had ripped the heart out of the community, leaving behind a trail of devastation that seemed without end. Yet, amidst the chaos and destruction, a glimmer of hope began to stir. In the face of unimaginable tragedy, the resilience of the human spirit started to emerge as survivors banded together in defiance of the forces that had wrought such havoc upon their world. The Aleutian Islands Quakequake Crisis would prove to be a test unlike any other, but one that the people would ultimately overcome, scarred, battered, and forever changed by the experience. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an ominous shadow over the Aleutian Islands, the very fabric of reality began to unravel. The initial tremors, which had sent residents scrambling for safety, were only the precursor to a calamity that would shake the foundations of history. The first quake struck without warning, its force so immense that it seemed to shatter the air itself. The ground trembled beneath the feet of terrified onlookers as ancient volcanoes roared back to life, belching forth geysers of steam and ash that choked the air with noxious fumes. The once stable landscape was now a maelstrom of chaos where every moment seemed to hold a new terror. As the quakes continued to unfold like a symphony of destruction. Each subsequent tremor built upon the previous one's intensity, creating a feedback loop of escalating devastation. The island's ancient volcanoes, long dormant and thought to be harmless, now unleashed their fury upon the islands. The very earth itself seemed to be alive, thrashing about like a wounded beast as it unleashed its wrath. The frequency of these quakes was unprecedented, one every 15 minutes, a relentless drumbeat of destruction that left barely enough time for those caught in its path to scramble for shelter. Panic reigned supreme as emergency services were stretched to the breaking point by the initial tremors and faced the prospect of being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of destruction. And yet, amidst this apocalyptic landscape, there existed a glimmer of humanity, a testament to the indomitable will to survive that defined the Aleutian people. In the face of unimaginable terror, they clung to each other, their bonds forged in the fire of adversity as they struggled to endure the unendurable. As night fell, the quakes intensified, their rhythmic pounding echoing through the darkness like the beat of some monstrous heart. The wind howled in anguish, whipping up waves that crashed against the shore with a fury that threatened to engulf everything in its path. The once clear skies grew dark and foreboding, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the destruction below. In this maelstrom of chaos, the very notion of safety became an illusion. The future itself hung precariously in the balance, as if the course of history was being rewritten by this cataclysmic event. And yet, amidst the devastation, a glimmer of hope flickered, a testament to the indomitable spirit that would eventually rise from the ashes of disaster, determined to rebuild and forge a new path forward. As the Quakequake raged on, its power and fury seemed boundless, a force that would not be satiated until it had exacted its full toll upon the islands. As the relentless earthquakes ravaged the Aleutian Islands, the landscape was transformed from a tranquil haven into a scene of utter devastation. The very foundations of communities were torn asunder, leaving in their wake a trail of ruin and despair. Generations-old infrastructure crumbled, reduced to rubble and dust, as buildings that had weathered countless storms now lay in shattered remains. The once thriving fishing ports, where boats and nets were carefully maintained, were left useless and submerged beneath the icy waters of the Bering Sea. The mournful cries of gulls echoed through the desolate landscape, a poignant reminder of the destruction wrought upon the islanders' livelihoods. Neighborhoods vanished, swallowed up by the churning earth, as homes passed down through generations were reduced to splintered remains. Families found themselves without shelter or protection, while streets that once bustled with activity now lay eerily silent, punctuated only by the distant rumble of quakes still shaking the islands. Supply chains vital to daily life on the islands were severed, leaving food stores depleted and medical supplies lost forever. The islanders, reeling from the initial shockwaves, were forced to confront the harsh reality that their very survival was now in question. In the midst of this chaos, emergency services struggled to keep pace with the unfolding disaster. Medical personnel and rescue teams battled against impossible odds, racing against time to reach those trapped beneath the rubble or injured by falling debris. Communication networks, already strained by the sheer scale of destruction, were pushed to the breaking point as desperate calls for help went unanswered. As night descended upon the ravaged islands, the islanders huddled together in makeshift shelters, praying for the quakes to cease and the dawn to bring relief. Gazing up at the star-filled sky, they knew that the road to recovery would be long and arduous, with countless challenges still ahead. In the aftermath of this catastrophic event, the Aleutian Islands were forever changed. The very fabric of their society was torn asunder, leaving behind a legacy of loss, sacrifice, and resilience in the face of unimaginable tragedy. As the dust settled, the true extent of devastation became clear. The sheer scale of destruction left authorities scrambling to respond effectively, their efforts hindered by treacherous terrain and dwindling medical supplies. Helicopters, typically the go-to choice for disaster relief, were grounded due to strong winds and turbulence. Ground teams equipped with heavy-duty equipment and first aid kits had to navigate treacherous terrain, traversing ravines, crevices, and landslides. As they combed through the rubble, rescue workers encountered scenes of utter devastation. Buildings, reduced to piles of debris, told stories of families torn apart, homes destroyed, and livelihoods lost. Once thriving fishing ports, a testament to the region's rich maritime history, were now nothing more than a tangled mess of twisted metal and shattered dreams. Medical supplies, already strained from initial disaster response efforts, began to dwindle as the scale of casualties became apparent. Emergency responders, with makeshift clinics set up in temporary tents, struggled to treat injured survivors, many of whom suffered severe injuries, including spinal cord damage, internal bleeding, and traumatic amputations. As night fell on the ravaged islands, a sense of hopelessness settled over survivors. The darkness amplified the screams of those trapped beneath rubble, their cries for help lost in the wind. Those who had escaped the worst huddled together, sharing stories of loss and trauma, as winds howled through the desolate landscape. In the midst of chaos, authorities scrambled to establish communication networks, coordinate relief efforts, and provide aid to affected survivors. But even the best-laid plans were hampered by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. The Aleutian Islands Quakequake Crisis had become a crisis of epic proportions, testing the mettle of rescue workers, emergency responders, and the resilience of survivors. As dawn broke on the devastation, a new day began, marked by the sounds of helicopters thundering overhead, the rumble of heavy machinery clearing debris, and whispered prayers from those seeking solace in the face of unimaginable tragedy. As the tremors finally subsided, a collective sigh of relief wafted across the battered Aleutian Islands. The Earth's fury had spent itself, leaving behind a landscape ravaged by destruction and chaos. But like an unwelcome guest, a new threat emerged from the depths of the Earth. Toxic gas emissions from cracked underground reservoirs began to contaminate the air. At first, the noxious fumes were barely perceptible, a faint whisper on the wind. However, as the days passed, the air grew thick with the acrid scent of hydrogen sulfide and methane, a pungent cocktail that made eyes water and lungs burn. The once pristine skies turned a sickly shade of yellow, as if even the atmosphere itself had been infected by the devastation below. Residents, already reeling from the quake's relentless assault, struggled to comprehend this new menace. Their nostrils stinging, their throats constricting, they stumbled through the streets, desperate for respite from the toxic haze. The once familiar landscape now seemed alien, as if the very air had turned against them. In a bid to protect themselves, makeshift masks began to appear, crude contraptions fashioned from scraps of cloth, wire mesh, and whatever else could be scavenged. These primitive respirators offered scant protection against the noxious fumes, but were better than nothing, providing a fleeting sense of security as people moved through the ravaged terrain. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the people of the Aleutian Islands learned to navigate this treacherous new landscape, one where every breath was a gamble with their health. Yet even amidst this unrelenting struggle, they found solace in each other's company, forging bonds that would help them persevere through the darkness that had descended upon their beloved island. In the midst of crisis, a sense of community emerged, neighbors banding together, sharing what little they had, and working tirelessly to adapt to their new reality. Amidst the devastation, a resilience born of adversity began to take hold, as those who called the Aleutian Islands home rallied together in the face of an unprecedented threat. The streets became a sea of makeshift masks, with individuals donning their own peculiar creations, in a bid to shield themselves from the poisonous air. Some wore tattered cloth wrapped around their faces, while others fashioned elaborate contraptions involving twine, wire, and scraps of fabric. As the world held its breath in anticipation of the international community's response, the devastating impact of the Aleutian Islands Quakequake Crisis of 5341 CE became increasingly clear. The unprecedented scale of destruction left no one untouched, and it was evident that global cooperation would be essential in addressing the catastrophe. In the immediate aftermath, aid shipments from around the world poured in, a testament to humanity's capacity for compassion and resilience. Cargo planes and ships laden with food, medical supplies, and shelter materials arrived on the islands, bringing much-needed relief to those affected by the tragedy. Among the first responders were teams of international search and rescue experts who braved treacherous terrain and challenging weather conditions to reach remote communities. These dedicated individuals worked tirelessly to locate survivors, extricate trapped victims from rubble, and provide medical assistance to those injured in the disaster. As aid efforts got underway, world leaders convened emergency meetings to coordinate a unified response to the crisis. Representatives from governments, NGOs, and international organizations converged on makeshift headquarters, set up in temporary shelters and command centers. The United Nations played a crucial role in mobilizing global resources and expertise, working closely with regional authorities to ensure an effective and coordinated response. Meanwhile, scientists and experts flocked to the islands to assess the full extent of the damage and provide critical advice on how to mitigate ongoing risks. They worked alongside local authorities to develop strategies for stabilizing crumbling infrastructure, purifying contaminated water supplies, and addressing toxic gas emissions that continued to pose a threat to public health. As international teams worked together to address immediate needs, attention turned to long-term consequences. Governments, organizations, and individuals pledged support for rebuilding efforts, recognizing that recovery would be a slow and arduous process. In the face of overwhelming destruction, it was clear that international cooperation had never been more crucial. The world came together in solidarity with the embattled people of the Aleutian Islands, acknowledging that this unprecedented disaster required a collective response. As the dust settled and quakes subsided, humanity rallied around these islands, demonstrating its capacity for resilience, compassion, and unity in the face of adversity. As the tremors of the quakes subsided, the Aleutian Islands were left to confront an unprecedented landscape of devastation. The once thriving communities lay in ruins, their homes destroyed and livelihoods shattered. Amidst the chaos and despair, a glimmer of hope began to emerge. On March 15, 1341 BCE, scientists from around the world achieved a groundbreaking breakthrough. After tireless efforts, they successfully developed a revolutionary technology that harnessed the energy released by the quakes, powering the region's recovery. This innovation sparked a tidal wave of optimism among the affected communities. For the first time since the disaster struck, people saw a future worth fighting for. The knowledge that their situation was not hopeless and that they had the potential to rebuild and recover gave them the strength and determination needed to face the challenges ahead. As news of the breakthrough spread, it inspired a renewed sense of hope and determination across the region. People who had been living in squalid conditions, struggling to survive on meager rations, began to envision a brighter future. They started rebuilding, using the energy generated by the quakes to power their new homes, businesses, and communities. The impact was not limited to the Aleutian Islands alone. The international community took notice of humanity's capacity for resilience and determination in the face of catastrophic disaster. This newfound hope inspired cooperation on a global scale as nations came together to support the region's recovery. In the years that followed, the Aleutian Islands began their arduous journey towards rebirth. With the revolutionary technology at their disposal, they made significant progress. The region became a beacon of hope and determination, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. The turning point had been reached, marking a new chapter in the history of the Aleutian Islands. This was a time of great challenge and uncertainty, but also immense opportunity and possibility. Though difficulties lay ahead, the people of the region were prepared to face them head-on, armed with the knowledge that their future was bright and full of hope. Here is the rewritten narrative. As the dust finally settled on the ravaged Aleutian Islands, the people began their long journey of recovery. The world watched in awe as the region slowly rebuilt from the ashes of devastation. And amidst the chaos and despair, a glimmer of hope emerged, a testament to humanity's capacity for resilience and adaptation. The once thriving villages lay in ruins, their residents struggling to come to terms with unimaginable loss. The air was heavy with the stench of death and decay as the bodies of those who had perished began to surface. Yet, amidst the devastation, a sense of determination began to stir within the survivors. It was as if they drew strength from their collective suffering, forging an unbreakable bond that would carry them through the darkest of times. As the world looked on, it became clear that this crisis would forever be etched in history as a testament to human resilience. The Aleutian Islands Quakequake Crisis of 5341 BCE served as a poignant reminder of our capacity for adaptation and perseverance in the face of catastrophic adversity. In the months and years that followed, the region's residents worked tirelessly to rebuild their shattered lives. They labored day and night, fueled by a burning desire to reclaim their homes and restore their communities. As they did, something remarkable began to take shape, a testament to the indomitable human spirit that had always defined this unforgiving but majestic landscape. Today, the Aleutian Islands stand as a beacon of hope, a shining example of what can be achieved when humanity comes together in the face of adversity. The region's people have rebuilt and revitalized their communities, emerging stronger and more resilient than ever before. As we look back on this catastrophic event, we are reminded that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of hope, a testament